Welcome to today's webinar on PeopleSoft and ElasticSearch Security Examined. My name is Phil Ryman. I'm the Director of Business Development at Integrigy, and I'll be the moderator for this e-learning session. Our speaker today is Stephen Coast. Steve is the Chief Technology Officer and founder of Integrigy Corporation, and he's been working with Oracle products since 1994. And for the past several years, Steve has focused on the security and auditing aspects of the PeopleSoft applications and Oracle database. Steve has authored white papers, given webinars, and presented on these topics at the National Collaborative Conferences. Steve is recognized internationally for his vast security knowledge and expertise. I'll now turn it over to Steve.
Thanks so much, Phil. Today we're going to talk about in-depth ElasticSearch, which is a newer component of PeopleSoft. And the reason I'm doing this presentation is because Integrigy does a lot of work with PeopleSoft clients, and as part of those security assessments and running our vulnerability scanning tool AppSentry, we're finding a lot of issues within the PeopleSoft environment, especially related to ElasticSearch. And whenever you have a new component such as ElasticSearch, there's always issues. People don't understand it. The DBAs, the PeopleSoft administrators, aren't as familiar with a new technology as they should be. Therefore, mistakes can happen, misconfigurations can happen, people tend to open things up and things like that. So we're going to really dive into more on the infrastructure side of ElasticSearch, but really dive in. How does the security work? What do you need to be thinking about, and how does it impact your overall PeopleSoft environment? Before we get started, a quick background about Integrigy. Integrigy was founded in 2002 by former Big Six consultants working on large ERP implementations. Back then, people weren't even changing the basic database passwords and things like that. And so we've come a long way, but there's still significant issues. When you're thinking about Oracle Business Suite and PeopleSoft, these are some of the largest IT applications in the world. Very complex, very in-depth. Therefore, you need to focus in on the security. And oftentimes, they hold very significant data. So Integrigy specializes in both Oracle Business Suite and PeopleSoft security. We do it a couple of different ways. We have a set of products, one being AppSentry, which is a scanning and validation tool for your security. So it scans the entire technology stack of your PeopleSoft environment, both the database, application servers being either WebLogic or WebSphere, and the Tuxedo to make sure that those configurations are secure. Think about it as taking the red book from Oracle on PeopleSoft security and expanding that out and doing a couple hundred more checks than that are in that document. So really validating all layers of the technology stack, making sure it's secure. Our other product is AppDefend, which is a proactive layer of defense for your PeopleSoft environment. So if you're not immediately applying Oracle Critical Patch Updates, AppDefend is providing a web application firewall to protect the PeopleSoft environment. So it's actually blocking attacks against and PeopleSoft applications, be it SQL injection, cross-site scripting, other things. This presentation is mostly from our services work. So we're on site, not right now being on site, but doing a lot of our work remotely, working on security assessments for our PeopleSoft customers. So we're helping them, how do you secure this very large application that has many different components and many different pieces? How do you make sure it's SOC compliant, PCI, HIPAA, helping to implement other tools along with it, be it database vault, Oracle Transparent Data Encryption. And finally, we're backed up by a world-class research team. So Integrigy is actively internally doing research and development to make sure that your ERP and databases are secure within your organization. And finally, Integrigy works very closely with Oracle. We're an Oracle Gold partner and have very good relationships with Oracle to make sure that your environments are secure, that your applications and databases are as secure as they can be. Enough about Integrigy. Let's now jump into the topic. And what is one of the reasons that we're really talking about this? Back in late 2018 and early 2019, a lot of ElasticSearch databases were getting hacked. They were getting hacked primarily because they were on the internet, but they weren't very well secured. And so a lot of organizations were bringing up this new technology, and it's great. And ElasticSearch does a very good job on allowing you to search data, find data very quickly, index that data. Unfortunately, again, with any new technology, people don't have a very good, deep understanding, especially around the security. So even Elastic, the company behind ElasticSearch, recognized this. So they recognize that there's a significant security challenge that many databases are getting hacked. There's a significant challenges and problems around Elasticsearch, and it's really because they didn't have an understanding of how Elasticsearch security works. In this presentation, we're going to actually combine that. Now we're not only talking about just Elasticsearch, we're talking about how do you integrate this with a very complex application like PeopleSoft. And so there's this dynamic of both PeopleSoft and Elasticsearch on how to secure not only one, but both working in conjunction. So before we go too far in depth, let's talk a little about terminology. So there are different components of the Elasticsearch. So the key phrase here is Elasticsearch. This is the software that's actually based on an open source tool called Lucerne, and it's a search engine, and it's very capable, very feature rich. And what it's doing is allowing you to do free text searches against data and return that result very quickly. And so Elasticsearch is the open source code, which is the search engine, which PeopleSoft is implementing. In order to replace the old search capability, they've now replaced that with the open source product called Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch also has a couple components that layer on top of it. The first being Kibana. Kibana is a very good data visualization tool, dashboarding tool that really lets you see the data within Elasticsearch, how it's working, bring up the data very quickly, and things like that. And finally, the last piece of the Elasticsearch technology stack is called Logstash. Logstash is a tool that allows you to take in data and actually put it into Elasticsearch. So you're taking it from different sources, different formats, and Elasticsearch is providing, or Logstash is providing that capability to consume that data and actually transform it and put it into Elasticsearch so that you can then use it. And finally, behind all this, and what they're calling now ELK, is Elasticsearch, Kibana, and Logstash, is called the ELK stack. There's a company behind it called Elastic. And Elastic is taking those open source components, and again, Elasticsearch, Kibana, and Logstash are all open source, but the Elastic company is now taking this and actually bundling it together and adding commercial add-ons on top of it. So the company behind Elasticsearch now in terms of development is the Elastic company. So let's dive into now PeopleSoft and Elasticsearch. So there are some security challenges here that you need to be aware of. So what do you need to be thinking about when you're starting to implement Elasticsearch? You may be doing a PeopleTools upgrade 8.5.8, something like that today. What you need to be thinking about is now you're switching over potentially from the old search system to now Elasticsearch. How does this work? What do you need to be doing in terms of making this most productive, effective for you? Well, there's a couple of major issues involved. The first is Oracle is delivering you Elasticsearch behind the scenes. So they're giving you the Elasticsearch implementation, bundling it up, packaging it up, making it work seamlessly with PeopleSoft. There are a couple issues around that. What they're doing is taking a specific version of Elasticsearch and doing that. So you're not just downloading Elasticsearch from Elastic, installing it, working with it. What you're actually doing is installing it from Oracle. So Oracle is giving you a very fixed version. So there's actually only 3 versions of Elasticsearch that you can work with PeopleSoft, being 2.3.2, 6.1.2, and 7.0. And depending on your PeopleTools version, depends on which version you run. So you can't be updating that yourself. So once you install 7.0 Elasticsearch, given to you by the DBKs from Oracle, you can't really be upgrading it. So you actually have to now rely on Oracle to provide you security patches or other changes that are necessary. Fundamentally, think of this as a fork of Elasticsearch from Oracle. They're not really doing much with the code. They're just bundling it up, packaging it, giving you security plugins and things like that. Another challenge that comes in with Elasticsearch, the base Elasticsearch is very fundamental. There's very few security features built into the core Elasticsearch code. And those are provided by a number of third parties and also Elastic. So Elastic used to sell the commercial add-ons in terms of security plugins, in terms of authentication, encryption, those types of things were actually in their X pack. Amazon also delivers a version of Elasticsearch that's public domain, and they provide another set of security plugins. There's some third-party security plugins. The most famous one is SearchGuard, which provides a number of security capabilities. The issue here is those security plugins you cannot use with ElasticSearch, because the ElasticSearch that you've got for the PeopleSoft environment is actually provided by Oracle, and Oracle doesn't support any third-party plugins being installed in that. So instead, what Oracle has done is they're providing you these capabilities. Again, somewhat minimal, but there should be enough. There's a couple gaps here, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. As part of the presentation, and again, you'll get a copy of this presentation in the next 24 hours, I've included the detailed references. So Oracle does have very good documentation around Elasticsearch with PeopleSoft. It is very dependent on the PeopleTools version. As we go through this presentation, you'll see how dependent it is on versions and PeopleTools versions. So again, but I've documented out kind of the key reference manuals here. And I've also provided a set of my Oracle support note IDs that are the security-related notes around implementing Elasticsearch. So how do you actually monitor some of these things? How do you actually do some security patching? Which versions are supported on which PeopleTools versions and things like that. So I won't go into these in depth, but I just wanted to at least document these out so it gives you a good reference about where to look for this information that we talked about in this presentation today. There's also some good security references out there related to Elasticsearch, but again, take this with a grain of salt because these are specific to Elasticsearch, not Oracle's implementation of Elasticsearch. Because again, there's certain things you can do within the Oracle Elasticsearch, which you can't do based on these references. We'll say, oh, change this. That may not be supported by Oracle. So through this presentation, we'll kind of document out what can you change, what works well, what doesn't work well, and things like that. Okay, so kind of let's now get into the meat of the discussion and talk about specifically Elasticsearch within the PeopleSoft environment. And the fundamental thing you need to be thinking first about is that the Elasticsearch version supported per PeopleTools version is very specific and very limited in terms of what is supported. So when we start talking about 858 of PeopleTools, you only can run Elasticsearch 7.0, which will then be delivered typically as a DPK. And it is all bundled up. It is all one unit. It's all pre-configured for you. 857 only supports 612. Depending on 856, if you're still running that older version of PeopleTools, it's 612 is the recommended version. And you can run a fairly old version, 232. But again, that's to the minor versions of PeopleTools. It's only supported on certain ones. So again, Oracle is kind of forcing you to do some upgrades. But again, it's positive upgrades. But we're now talking about PeopleTools and Elasticsearch. But when we look at Elasticsearch's current version is 7.8. So Oracle is not just one release behind. It's actually a fair number of releases behind that you need to be looking at and trying to figure out. So when we now talk about these releases, they go back a fair ways in terms of dates. So if you're still running an older PeopleTools version and looking at it, 7.2.3 is a fairly old version. So this is not a recent version at all. So it was actually released in April of 2016. So if you're on an older PeopleTools version, you're kind of stuck on a very old Elasticsearch version. So that becomes important. At least if you're moving up to 857, 856, you're on 612 of Elasticsearch. Again, it is over 2 years old. And even if you're running the latest 858 of PeopleTools, you're on 7.0 of Elasticsearch. That's at least a year old, a little bit longer than that. So again, these are fairly old versions that you need to be looking at and thinking about. And this kind of impacts security because again, when something is a little bit older, there's potential for security vulnerabilities. And again, Oracle is patching these, but not to the most recent versions. So there is no way to actually just upgrade to 7.8 of Elasticsearch because again, Oracle is controlling the version. You're stuck on these very specific versions. So how is Oracle doing this and making this all work, especially with PeopleSoft? How do they actually make all the integration work? One of the key features of ElasticSearch and why it's so successful is it's got a very robust plugin framework. And the plugin framework allows you to add a lot of additional capabilities, both in kind of how ElasticSearch works in terms of analysis and processing and transformation and searching and adding in additional ways you can actually search for the data. But it's also very flexible in terms of allowing you to manipulate the security, because out of the box, ElasticSearch doesn't provide any security. It's basically wide open. You kind of install it, and there's actually not even a login when you start accessing it. And so they've provided that layer of security was always provided as plugins. And again, a number of organizations provide those plugins. So what Oracle has done is they've provided a fairly robust, deep layer of security in ElasticSearch by providing their own plugin. And so the key part when we're talking about security with ElasticSearch and PeopleSoft is really this Oracle PeopleSoft security plugin, which provides both the integration capability as well as the security layer within ElasticSearch for PeopleSoft. So this plugin is actually providing that direct integration. So I can actually log in to parts of ElasticSearch, and it'll actually be using my PeopleSoft user ID. You'll also have direct access to PS Cipher, so I'm providing that encryption support. And by the way, that network encryption is not enabled by default, isn't even provided with ElasticSearch by default, because again, it's implemented as a plugin always. So Oracle had to provide that capability to do network encryption. So really the key way this all works, and we'll kind of discuss this and actually touch on it a number of points, is that there's a security plugin behind the scenes that's providing all this layer of integration and capability. And then again, Oracle is providing a number of other plugins, both to allow you to give more crawling capabilities that you can actually process, like a Word document, a PDF document. It's providing system monitoring capabilities integrated with PeopleSoft. They're providing additional attachment plugins, additional net analysis plugins, and things like that. But again, if you're looking to do something within ElasticSearch with PeopleSoft, you can't be just downloading your own plugins. Oracle has provided what they think is a fairly robust, good set, but it's not complete. You can't just now go in and say, oh, I want to do this nifty plugin I saw that we're using on our other ElasticSearch that's not related to PeopleSoft. Well, unfortunately, you can't use that within the PeopleSoft ElasticSearch environment because it's not supported by Oracle. Will it work? Yes, it most likely will work. Will it cause a problem? Most likely not. But again, around the security side, I would never apply another plugin to ElasticSearch. But if I had some plugin that did wildcard searching or something really nice on the search side, there's no reason it wouldn't work there. But anything that with the security plugins, that most likely will interfere and potentially may override what Oracle's trying to do on their security plugin. So any security plugin would never work and should never be implemented. And we actually have seen some clients based on their security team, oh, we need to apply all these security plugins to ElasticSearch because that's part of our documentation, our standard for ElasticSearch. We've seen it cause problems. We've seen it actually open things up when it shouldn't have been. So you have to be very careful around that. So when you're thinking about plugins, our recommendation is don't apply any other plugins, or if you do apply plugins, be very, very cautious because, again, it's not supported by Oracle. So when we talk about the fixed versions, again, Oracle's delivering ElasticSearch for very specific versions. So if you're on 8.5.8 of PeopleTools, you can only run 7.0. You can't upgrade. So if there's a security vulnerability, the way ElasticSearch handles that is they release a new version. So in order to get the latest security upgrades, there's not patches, there's new versions. And so in order to apply security patches, you actually have to upgrade the version if you're running just a standalone ElasticSearch environment. In the PeopleSoft context, what Oracle is doing is they're patching it. They're providing you a patch to fix the issues. And fortunately, in the last 3 years, there's been very few security vulnerabilities around ElasticSearch that would have impacted a PeopleSoft environment. And so I've documented those 3 security vulnerabilities here, and Oracle patched these out of bandwidth from the ElasticSearch. So they were actually updating the code that they were compiling, delivering to you as part of ElasticSearch. And Oracle does this in a number of other different products. So this is not foreign area for Oracle. This is a very standard method that Oracle has used across numerous products. They do this in Oracle Business Suite and some other products that we work very closely with. So when we saw the way they were doing this, is okay, that's standard Oracle. This is how they actually manage this. And it actually works. What happens here, though, is you're running potentially let's say you're running PeopleTools 857, therefore you'd be running 612 of Elasticsearch. Well, if your security team or anybody says, oh, you're running 612 of Elasticsearch, that's so old, you guys have to be upgrading. You don't have security patches. You then have to explain to that security team, yes, we do have security patches because we're applying it. Also, as part of the security vulnerabilities, Elasticsearch is a Java component. It is a Java application and is coming bundled with a Java environment. So as part of these security upgrades, Oracle is also always updating the Java behind the scenes. And so that's also important to note because a lot of organizations are now really looking at their Java implementations and trying to weed out the older versions and actually upgrade those. So it's very important that as you upgrade Elasticsearch, you're also upgrading the Java environment behind the scenes with it. So again, Elasticsearch is a Java application, and it's important to note when you install PeopleSoft and across different servers, you're actually bundling multiple Java environments along with that. So when we're talking about running WebLogic or WebSphere, that will have its own Java installation as part of it. When you install Elasticsearch, there is actually a Java JVM, Java virtual machine, installed with Elasticsearch in the Elasticsearch directories. And so this is done through the DPKs that you're installing this and getting this Java runtime environment. And it's using the Java runtime environment 1.8. So again, every quarter, Oracle is upgrading the Java runtime environment to a new version to fix many, many different security vulnerabilities. I don't remember how many were in this quarter, but it's usually typically about 20 to 30 security vulnerabilities in Java every single quarter. And that's the only way you can update it. So we've got a number of organizations we work with now who actually are doing operating system scans, and they specifically look for outdated Java environments. And therefore, if you're not updating the Elasticsearch through the DPK that's released each quarter, you've got an older Java run stack there. Fortunately, we have not been able to find any Elasticsearch vulnerabilities that can be exploited because they're in the Java, an older Java environment. So again, you're running Elasticsearch, it's a Java application, it's running an outdated, potentially, version of Java. Those security vulnerabilities in that outdated version of Java are very hard to exploit by just connecting to Java, connecting to Elasticsearch and using the application. So we haven't found any cases yet because, again, we do that analysis to look at Elasticsearch and the JVM, what potential vulnerabilities could you actually exploit? We actually haven't been able to find any to date. Not saying that there aren't any, but again, that's always a risk. It's always a potential because some of those Java security vulnerabilities are very deep in the code. They're still serialization vulnerabilities. And if you find the right code, they could be potentially exploitable. So again, yep, the end of story here is that you need to be updating the Java as part of Elasticsearch, and the way you do that is part of the quarterly patch updates and by installing the new Elasticsearch DPK over your existing Elasticsearch in order to update it. And again, you're not updating the Elasticsearch. There may be some plugin updates, there may be some other updates, but Elasticsearch, if you're on PeopleTools 858, it will still stay at 7.0. You're just getting additional fixes in terms of the plugin updates and in terms of Java updates as part of those DPKs. So now let's kind of get into some of the security topics here. What do you need to be thinking about? What are the issues around Elasticsearch within a PeopleSoft environment that you need to be kind of addressing? One that is actually not directly resolved by Oracle as part of the configuration that they're giving you is that the data within Elasticsearch is not encrypted by default. Most organizations, in order to do that, running Elasticsearch outside of PeopleSoft, you would then download a plugin, and there's multiple different plugins available that allow on-disk encryption of the Elasticsearch data. Because again, the Elasticsearch information is stored in binary files, but those are fundamentally clear text. So if I have a credit card number, a social security number that I'm searching and indexing as part of the PeopleTools environment, that will actually show up as clear text. I've most likely encrypted in my database, in the PeopleSoft database. I'm most likely, hopefully, using transparent data encryption to encrypt that data. But now I may be indexing some sensitive data in my PeopleSoft environment that is then getting sent to Elasticsearch to be indexed to allow search to work. That data will now be in a second place. It'll be duplicated. It's fundamentally duplicated from the PeopleSoft database to the Elasticsearch database, and now it'll be stored in clear text. Oracle doesn't have a solution for this. They are not allowing support for the encryption plugins. Therefore, there's no native way to do this. Typically, most organizations would use the Linux feature called Encrypt, which actually will let you to create encrypted volumes, and that way you can actually encrypt the data on disk. Therefore, if someone steals the files, that data is encrypted, and it can be only accessed by the Elasticsearch user and the Elasticsearch processes. It's fundamentally how it locks it down. So Encrypt allows you to actually, as a root user, set up security permissions to enforce access to that data in an unencrypted form to certain users and certain processes on the machine. This is not officially supported by Elastic, and only if you have a platinum license of Elasticsearch does Elastic support it. But this works fairly well. It's fairly transparent. There's really not any issues. We have never seen any issues in terms of either support, working with it. Many Elasticsearch environments run Encrypt in order to do this, and it works fairly well. There's really not much of a performance overhead either. Again, the PeopleSoft usage of Elasticsearch is significant. It's indexing a bunch of data, but you're not talking about the most high performance environment here on the planet. This is, it's every time someone types in search in PeopleSoft, you're doing a search, but again, you're not doing millions and millions of those every day or every hour. Therefore, the performance is good enough. You'll probably see a 2 to 5% performance overhead in terms of CPU and response time. So therefore, it adds a little bit, but the data is encrypted and it's not a significant overhead to the overall environment. So staying on the encryption topic, the next layer is that was on disk encryption. So again, on the server, so if someone steals a disk drive, you lose a backup tape, you lose one of the Elasticsearch data files, the data is encrypted, someone would need encryption keys to do it. The other side of encryption is network encryption. So what's happening across the network? Where is this data flowing across the network? What connections are being made? And what's important to think about Elasticsearch is, again, now you're adding, as part of the PeopleSoft environment, more network ports, more access, more things working, additional server here, potentially even a clustered server. So as a background on the Elasticsearch network configuration, there's really 3 basic connections happening in your PeopleSoft environment. The first is Elasticsearch runs its kind of client connection to allow clients to connect. And at this point, PeopleSoft is the client connecting, but you can also connect to this directly from like a browser. And that's running on port 9200. So data is flowing across that. And that's how PeopleSoft will load the data in. It will be actually sending it across this connection to load some of the data in, to actually access the queries, return results across the network. It's all operating across this unencrypted connection by default. It's using the HTTP protocol, using REST within that to actually to send queries in and get results. That's default port 9200. The other connection here is the inner node. So Elasticsearch, one of the key features that most large PeopleSoft environments are running, but we have actually worked with a lot of smaller PeopleSoft environments that actually don't use the clustering. But Elasticsearch has very robust clustering that you can set up in very large clusters that is very high performance, very robust, very fault tolerant, works very well. That interconnection between all those clustered nodes is actually running on port 9300. It's a proprietary protocol to Elasticsearch that then sends data back and forth. So again, if I lose one server, I'm not losing any data. My cluster stays up. Very fault tolerant, very robust in that term. But again, I have to be thinking about, well, I've got data transferring across those nodes because, again, it's taking the data, duplicating it to multiple cluster nodes in case there's any fault within the cluster. You're not losing any data, and all data is accessible at all times. Then finally, as part of PeopleTools 857 and above, and especially enhanced in 858, is Oracle then added in the Kibana client, which allows the data visualizations, dashboards, and other things to work. That also now is using a different port. So that web server is running on port 5601. So you actually have 3 different major connections happening. So if you install a ElasticSearch node, you bring it up, you're actually going to see 3 different ports running with 3 different purposes across the network. So where this becomes important is that data by default is not encrypted. So if someone sends a query into Elasticsearch, returns the data, that is not encrypted across the network. If you run Kibana to actually do a visualization of the data, that's not encrypted. So therefore, encryption should be turned on for all those parts. Unfortunately, within the Elasticsearch configuration, all that encryption is actually 3 different parts. You actually have to turn it on separately to encrypt those 3 different types of traffic. So again, the 3 different types of traffic are the PeopleSoft application servers, really the integration broker, talking to the Elasticsearch nodes, the Elasticsearch nodes talking to each other to send data back and forth, so all data is on multiple servers. And then finally, client end user, which is typically a PeopleSoft administrator, people looking at dashboards, talking to the Kibana server. That's a separate configuration. So when you actually try to set up the network encryption for Elasticsearch, you're actually having to do it in 3 different places and configuring it independently across those. Fortunately, number 1 and 2 are actually in the same file, but again, there's different settings. So you can turn one on and not the other. You can have different key stores for each one. And then Kibana is a whole separate configuration file. So it does take a little time and effort to actually get the network encryption up and running for the Elasticsearch. But again, otherwise you potentially may have sensitive data flowing across the network unencrypted. And this is completely independent of what you've done for PeopleSoft. So most organizations are setting up a load balancer for the PeopleSoft environment. So you're getting the network encryption from the load balancer. Unfortunately, you really can't do that with this Elasticsearch configuration here. So you're actually doing this independently on the Elasticsearch, not working through your network security team that then has a load balancer that is part of being a PeopleSoft administrator or a DBA. You're probably the one setting up, creating the certificates and managing it here. So another area is in terms of search results and masking of that sensitive data. This was actually somewhat of an issue with the early implementation of Elasticsearch and PeopleSoft, is that, again, I still need to search data, and I still may have to search Social Security numbers and other data that I want quick access to say, okay, where's this person's Social Security number? How do I find someone just based on Social Security number? Those types of things. And so again, your definition of sensitive data may be very broad. Some organizations are just Social Security numbers and credit card numbers. Other ones are date of birth, first name, last name, address. All that information in an HR system may be considered sensitive data. But I still want to search that. I want to search on somebody's last name. I want to bring up that piece of information. I may want to bring up a student's name and see what classes they're enrolled in, those types of things. Until 858, you could not actually mask any of that data. So if I did bring back some data that was considered sensitive, that data was just displayed as is on the page, and I would potentially have to do another tool to actually mask that or something like that. As part of the PeopleTools 858 update, especially with Elasticsearch 7.0, Oracle added those capabilities in that now I can actually start masking the sensitive data results, and I can get down to a very granular level of detail here. So I can actually go through and set this up, and in the search emit event, I can take any search field and start masking it. And it works fairly well. So again, this was a missing feature, has been added in 858 to actually help resolve this issue in terms of data that is masked normally in PeopleSoft, depending on the pages that are displayed, but was not being masked in the search results. So now they've actually extended that into the search results, which is a major enhancement. Another key concern around security is always like, I need to know what's happening in the environment. Who's actually using Elasticsearch? Is just the administrators? Because again, when I'm starting to talk about this, Oracle has the security. So there's potentials that if someone's given like the search administrator role, they can log into ElasticSearch directly and start accessing some of this data through things like Kibana. So a lot of people are like, oh no, no one else can access Elasticsearch, only if you go through PeopleSoft. And that's not true. I can actually access Elasticsearch directly. I can just now start going against some of these ports. If I know some of the user IDs, so there's like a Elasticsearch administrator, ES admin, I can connect directly to Elasticsearch. I can connect directly to Kibana and actually start pulling data back directly from Elasticsearch. I don't have to go through PeopleSoft. So it's always very important to have at least a layer of auditing and logging turned on so I actually get key security events. But again, one of the aspects of Elasticsearch is that those additional security features, those additional things that you'd want to do in terms of security, auditing, logging, are all plugins. And unfortunately, I can't run those plugins with the PeopleSoft Elasticsearch implementation because it doesn't support those plugins. So I do get some information, but this is one area that we think is kind of lacking in terms of there's some very robust auditing plugins as part of standard Elasticsearch that aren't included with Oracle's version. So therefore, the auditing and logging is what we would consider pretty basic. I'm getting things like failed logins, but I'm not getting captures of detailed login information about when someone's connecting and what data they're pulling, a full log file of every search. I'm getting some of that information in PeopleSoft, but I'm not getting that full detail as part of the Elasticsearch implementation. So if someone can figure out how to log into Elasticsearch directly, which is very feasible, very doable, fairly easy to do, I don't see that information. That information actually isn't logged. We don't have a good suggestion right now on how to resolve this, but there are some log files. You can turn on a little bit of additional logging. We've got some logs, log updates that we recommend that you do to the Elasticsearch environment to actually capture that information. But again, this is kind of one area of this implementation that has some weakness today, that Oracle's not, full visibility is not on this from Oracle. And that's pretty typical of Oracle products that, yeah, features and functionalities, but when you're really looking at some of these key security things that you'd want to see, Oracle just doesn't do it because no one really asks for it. But until there's a problem, until you get a breach, you won't have the visibility about what happened, what somebody was accessing if they were able to directly go into Elasticsearch, go to port 9200 and start doing REST queries because they're able to figure out one of the IPs. So some of the things that you can do is, again, this is a Java application, and so Elasticsearch is using a standard logging framework delivered by an open source community. And so Log4j is very robust and very feature rich. And so you can actually add in additional logs. And so we've got some, depending on the requirements, we turn on some additional logging by editing this. And again, the only problem is every time you do an upgrade, you do install a DPK, you actually have to reapply these because, again, Oracle is giving you a hard-coded configuration as part of some of this. And as soon as you do some upgrades, that potentially is overwritten. But Oracle does save log files forever, so that's nice, at least a nice feature of their configuration. But again, some of these tweaks so you can get some more additional logging so you can see some events happening within the database, and you can get very granular on this. So we actually turn on some logs that we get some very granular events to say, okay, if you want to get full visibility, but again, some of this has a little bit of a performance overhead, and it's based on requirements of what you want to do. So now let's get into some very specific features of the PeopleSoft Elasticsearch implementation. Kind of how is it implemented, what's it doing, some of the things that you need to be thinking about from an infrastructure perspective. Again, some of this is controlled through PeopleSoft, but a lot of it's actually controlled locally by Elasticsearch. So again, Elasticsearch is a separate entity, it's a separate server running, it's separate processes running. So there's actually users set up at the Elasticsearch layer. By default, Oracle gives you 2 users, and you can change the names of these if you want. So there's ES admin and people. And the people user has nothing to do with the PeopleSoft Connect ID. So a lot of people say, oh, well, it's all connected in the same user. No, it's actually 2 totally separate users. They have nothing to do with each other, and they're not related at all. They're just kind of the same name of the user. But again, the ES admin, think of this as the root user of ElasticSearch. It can do everything within ElasticSearch. And so when you actually install the ElasticSearch, you run through the DPK installation, it actually tells you to set the password. Some of the default passwords we see all the time are ESAdmin and ESAdmin1. So if you don't set the password, if you try to script it or something like that, we sometimes see those passwords, or people are just lazy and they just always set the password to the same because it's hard to remember a password, right? So why not just set it to username? So the key here is the ESAdmin has full security privileges, has full admin privileges, and has full read permissions on all the data. The people user is really what PeopleSoft is using to connect and do things, to pull some of the data. That's considered the ElasticSearch proxy user. That only has read permissions. So when data is put in, when PeopleSoft is administering the environment, it's using ESAdmin. For other tasks, it's actually using the people. There's an interesting point here is that this is actually managed and run by the Oracle security plugin. Because remember, by default, ElasticSearch has no security built into it. So these users are actually managed by the security plugin, not by ElasticSearch. So if you're looking for these users, they're actually in a separate directory that's actually under the Oracle plugin. And that also provides some other capabilities. The passwords are actually just created using PS Cipher or encrypted in that file. So when you're kind of looking at for these users where they're set up. And you can also add your own users. So there is no limitation on the PeopleSoft administrator or somebody else just going in and creating new ElasticSearch users to actually just use ElasticSearch directly. So you just use the ElasticSearch user, add user command to actually create new users. And some people do that. And we always kind of like, okay, what's that used for? Why is that user? Because again, that's bypassing all of PeopleSoft security, and it's going directly against ElasticSearch. And also these users are available in Kibana too. Kind of funny, if you want to change the passwords, we always get the question is, we tried to figure out how to change the ElasticSearch user passwords. We couldn't figure out how to do it. You actually use the add user command to change the password. And if the user already exists, it'll actually prompt you to change the password. So that's always one of those key questions is, well, we find that they have a weak ESAdmin password. We ask them to change it, and they're like, we have no idea because it's not clear. There's no change password. It's actually, you do add user and allows you to change the password. But again, you should definitely, because again, if the ESAdmin has a weak password, anybody can go directly against Elasticsearch, log in, and pull all the data they want. And again, it may be a subset of your PeopleSoft data, but there may be some sensitive data. There may be something that I can use. I can actually update that data and manipulate it at my will by using the ESAdmin. Within PeopleSoft, again, now the PeopleSoft security plugin is allowing certain access. So when I actually connect to Elasticsearch, it's actually checking my PeopleSoft credentials. And so I can either log in directly as one of these users. So I can log into ElasticSearch using ESAdmin. I can log into Kibana using ESAdmin. Or, based on the Oracle security plugin, I can actually log into ElasticSearch directly, not going through PeopleSoft at all. I'm logging directly to ElasticSearch or Kibana, and I can log in there directly and use my PeopleSoft credentials, depending if I have certain roles. So if I have the search administrator role, I can actually now go in to both Kibana and ElasticSearch and actually do some queries and bring up data and things like that. So again, that PeopleSoft security plugin has kind of two paths to it. It's managing local users, but it's also interfacing and pulling down users and roles from PeopleSoft to allow people to actually access some of the ElasticSearch components. Not going through PeopleSoft. This is, again, going directly to ElasticSearch. So when you're looking at who has what permissions, you need to be looking through the PeopleSoft roles, especially search administrator is the big one. Search server provides a little bit more. Search developer provides you kind of a middle. It's really search administrator is the one we focus mostly on because that's one that gives you a lot of capabilities within the ElasticSearch environment. So from a security perspective, how does this all work? What happens? And this is always a big question when we start working through with a client on PeopleSoft and ElasticSearch. Like, how does this actually work? What's happening behind the scenes? And there's actually a lot happening behind the scenes. So it's very important to at least get a basic understanding of this flow in terms of, I'm in PeopleSoft, I type in a search request, what actually happens? How does this actually work? And to make sure that I'm authorized to do this query and I'm only seeing the data that I'm authorized to do. So what happens is a user actually goes into PeopleSoft and they actually enter the query. And so it goes through a fairly robust set of processes to actually make sure that the query is executed properly, but also security is applied to that result. So again, I shouldn't ever be seeing something that I'm not authorized to in the PeopleSoft application, because remember, you're now duplicating the data from PeopleSoft into the Elasticsearch indexes, and so therefore I need to limit or filter out those results returned to the user so they can only see what they actually have access to. So what happens is when I actually enter that query, then it formats it as an Elasticsearch request. So I can type in a free-form text query with some wildcards and things like that. PeopleSoft will actually format that through PeopleTools, PT Search. Then it will actually send it through Integration Broker over to Elasticsearch. And that's when the magic starts happening, is that then I'm actually going through and taking those results and actually validating the security. Is this person authorized? It's using the ESAdmin account on Elasticsearch to actually log in and do that. It's executing the query, and it's actually going through then and actually taking the ACLs on the Elasticsearch, which have then been pulled in and cached for performance reasons. So there's actually a set of Oracle AC or PeopleSoft ACLs, basically the security authorizations, that are then cached in Elasticsearch. So then it can kind of go through and kind of filter out the results. And then it goes through a couple processes that actually filter out the results to make sure that the security is authorized. And then it sends the data back to PeopleTools through a callback process. And so again, it's going back through Integration Broker, and then it's displaying the results to the user. So again, this is a fairly complex workflow in terms of how the process works, multiple layers of security, caching of results, kind of mixing both Elasticsearch security with PeopleSoft security to make sure that you have the right both authorization to execute the query and the authorization to actually see those results. So again, there's lots of different pieces into this puzzle, and things can go wrong if you open things up too much. So when you're kind of designing the search queries, the search definitions, it is very important that that's done right, because it's very easy to say, oh, I just need it to make it work, and people tend to open that up fairly widely. We could do a whole hour webinar on how to design those processes right, make those correct, what problems we've seen actually at clients and things like that. So a lot of this discussion was around Elasticsearch security. So again, there's a couple components running here. So when you set up the Elasticsearch, you're really, especially in the 858 PeopleTools environment, you're getting Elasticsearch, Kibana, and Logstash. Kibana is the visualization tool. This is giving you health dashboards, application information that's then being stored and allows you to manipulate that data. You can also use Kibana to actually view all the other data in, depending on how security permissions are set up and things like that. You can actually use it for much more than Oracle intended you to use it by making some tweaks and some changes in the configuration. We see a few organizations doing that. Most organizations aren't really exploiting Elasticsearch and Kibana to the extent that we think they should be. But Kibana, in the next version, Oracle is spending a lot of time around Kibana development in terms of trying to expand this out, give you more capabilities. So Kibana was released in 8.5.7, and it was very, very limited. And actually, to log into Kibana, there was actually only one user, it was ESAdmin, again, that root Elasticsearch user, and you could just get basic information about indexes and things like that. As part of the PeopleTools 8.5.8 release, Oracle is now giving you dashboards, allowing you to pull up application information, health center information, much more significant data. They've also taken the authentication, is that you can log in still as the ESAdmin account. There's no data authorization around that. Again, that's why it's very important to control the ESAdmin, because again, I can now log into Kibana. I can now start pulling data. But Oracle also allows you to log in as any PeopleSoft user. So this is a totally separate login. I can go through PeopleSoft and click on a link, and it'll actually send me over and automatically get me into Kibana. Or I can just go to the Kibana login page, which is a separate login page from the PeopleSoft, and actually type in my PeopleSoft credentials. And as long as I have Search Administrator or privileges for any of these dashboards, I can now start seeing data within Kibana. And so based on the search definitions, my data authorization is based on how you set up those search definitions within PeopleSoft. Because again, PeopleSoft is sending over that ACL, that privilege information over to ElasticSearch so you can see it. So depending on what data you can see, it's all cached within ElasticSearch. And so you can actually now start setting up and seeing, if you go in under Kibana privileges, under the search framework, you can define out who can see what, or you can just be granting out the search administrator role to way too many users. Again, people are trying to set this up. I need some access. I can't make it work. So again, oftentimes we see the issues around Kibana security is that people are trying to make it work, and they just kind of start giving out search administrator role almost like candy. Like, again, yeah, you need to see it. But again, that search administrator can really see just about any data within ElasticSearch. So depending on what data you have in there, you may be now violating some of your segregation of duties principles and things like that on what somebody can see and are allowed to see. But again, Kibana is going to be with us for a long time here in the PeopleSoft environment, and Oracle is doing a lot more. So you'll actually see in 8.5.9 of PeopleTools and other even updates to 8.5.8, we're anticipating that Kibana will be leveraged heavily by Oracle. The PeopleTools team really likes Kibana, and they're actually trying to push a lot more functionality into it. Finally, wrapping up some additional security considerations. One that we're seeing quite often is, well, why should I be setting up all these Elasticsearch clusters, especially if I got a lot of test environments? It's just a lot of work, so we'll just create one and actually just send all the data to it. It works. It's actually supported by Oracle. And you can actually set up a single cluster and share that across multiple PeopleSoft environments. The problem is where this falls apart very quickly is the security is based on PeopleSoft user ID. That user ID doesn't include what environment you came from. So if I have a user ID Steve, that doesn't matter what environment Steve comes from, Steve will be allowed access to whatever Steve has based on the ACLs that have been sent over for the user ID Steve. So it kind of starts getting mixed on this. So for production, you should always have a separate Elasticsearch cluster. That cluster should never be shared. And we even take it to another extreme that we recommend typically for a large environment, 3 Elasticsearch clusters, one for production, one for any QA or test environments where you actually have live sensitive data, and then potentially just for ease of use, having a single Elasticsearch cluster shared across those kind of demo, dev environments where you typically don't have any sensitive data. But again, this is supported by Oracle. It works. A number of organizations are doing it because they just don't want to spend the time and effort to actually set up multiple Elasticsearch clusters. Finally, an issue that a lot of clients run into all the time is that, again, the PeopleSoft security credentials are being sent over to ElasticSearch from PeopleSoft. That's cached within ElasticSearch, which is great. It's great for performance. It works pretty well. And again, you don't have to have that pinging back and forth between ElasticSearch and PeopleSoft to get all the credentials and make sure that you're authorized and things like that. So it's just caching that information. It actually is pretty decent performance. When you type in something in that search box, it pops right up. That's actually works really well. But Oracle is doing certain things behind the scenes to make that perform well. One of the things is caching all the security information. So ACLs are cached. At some point, security credentials are actually cached too. And so there's actually some refresh intervals on this. And this often catches people by mistakes that they're trying to change this information. They're like, why is I just changed, it's not working. Well, it's not working because these security credentials are cached, and the cache by default is a 2-hour cache. So from a pure security perspective, if you have to revoke something from somebody, you always have to understand that it's not going to get revoked from them for 2 hours. So we've actually had one case where they had to actually terminate an employee. They were starting to revoke things, and the person was still trying to log into PeopleSoft after they were revoked. Well, that becomes an issue because they can directly log into Kibana if they have the right permissions, and their security credentials will still be active for at least 2 hours. Where this mostly comes into a problem is when you're actually doing test and development, you're trying to make this all work, and you're changing this, trying to make it work, and you're not understanding why it's not working. You can set that interval much lower on test and development environments. It pings back and forth quite a bit to get that information. Performance overhead is very low, it's almost negligible, but it kind of helps on your development process, or you can actually refresh that cache by going under the search test page and clicking on the button there to refresh the cache. So that was a high-level overview of PeopleSoft and ElasticSearch Security. Trying to look at it from an infrastructure perspective, we could spend a lot of time going through the PeopleSoft side of it on how you set up all these search definitions. People are more familiar with that. What I wanted to try to do is highlight the ElasticSearch issues. From a security perspective around ElasticSearch, what do you need to be thinking about? Because again, this is a new technology. We're seeing a lot of problems by organizations just because it's a new technology. They tend to open things up. They tend to have default passwords. And again, you're installing something new. You have to make sure it's patched. You have to make sure it's secured. And you have to do it well. And again, with any new technology, it's just a learning curve. And things where we see a lot of organizations who are mandating network encryption. Okay, they've done it fine on the PeopleSoft side, but they totally missed out on the ElasticSearch side. And so again, anybody can access some of these ports. How are you limiting that and things like that? So I'll actually turn it back over to Phil and see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Steve. Very informative. And yes, we do have some questions here today. First one, any reason to change the ESAdmin or People's user to different names?
Good question. We haven't actually seen any reason to. Because those are somewhat unique to the PeopleSoft ElasticSearch implementation, we don't actually see those on like default password lists or tools that are trying to break into ElasticSearch use those names. So there's really none of that security or obscurity requirements even to change it. So we see actually no reason for you to do it at this point. Just make sure that the passwords are changed. We're seeing actually more problems around the passwords of it rather than just the ESAdmin being people trying to exploit it or anything like that.
Next question. Is it possible to run ElasticSearch 7.0 with PeopleTools 8.57?
No, again, based on Oracle, these are very specific versions, and you have to run that version. So you're kind of locked in, and Oracle is providing those security patches for you or those updates.
Next question. Wasn't ElasticSearch decoupled from IB?
So depending on versions, but again, integration broker is the piece that's being used for the communication. So that has changed over time, but that's kind of one of the fundamental pieces here on how it's actually working and passing data back and forth. There's some components that Oracle has actually done in terms of direct updates, things like that to make it perform better. But some of the processes is still, when you run the query, it's still going through integration broker.
Next question, or statement actually. Our IT security team during scans identified ElasticSearch and are requiring us to upgrade the ElasticSearch.
Yeah, so now this is the explanation that you have to give to your security team. Again, the problem is that Oracle is fixing the version to, let's say, for PeopleTools 8.58 is 6 to 7.8 or 7.0. When your security team looks at it, they're going to say, oh my God, you should really need to be on 7.8 because that's a recommended version, that there's some security vulnerabilities and different aspects of it. Oracle has patched those security vulnerabilities separately and keeping it 7.0. So if you run a scan, you look at it, it's going to be 7.0. And so you have to explain to your security team that, yes, it is still 7.0, but Oracle has fixed those security vulnerabilities for us in that version. Fortunately, at the end of the day, there's only been a couple over time, so it's really not that huge of an issue in terms of security vulnerabilities in ElasticSearch environments at this point.
Here's another statement. If ElasticSearch databases are not exposed to the internet, then there is no perceived risk. I think that's the question.
Yeah, so this is the classic internal versus external. Yes, you should never be exposing Elasticsearch environment to the internet. That's caused the problems for a lot of people, not non-PeopleSoft environments. But again, it's just like your PeopleSoft environment. What's the risk if it's not exposed to the internet? Is it exposed internally? Our recommendation is, again, there's no reason anyone should be connecting to Elasticsearch directly. So in your network segmentation, you should be not allowing access to Elasticsearch 9200 except for the PeopleSoft environment, potentially some DBAs to do some troubleshooting and maintenance activities. But those ports, 9200, 9300, 5601 for Kibana, those should be limited as much as possible. Again, that reduces your risk of exposure from an internal attack. But again, Integrigy, one of the things we do is breach incident response. Internal networks are compromised all the time. If you look at most of the big breaches in the world, the internal network was compromised and then the breach occurred. So therefore, you should always assume that your internal network is compromised. Something will be coming from it internally. Therefore, anything that you can do internally on the network to limit access exposure to these different environments is very meaningful. And Elasticsearch fits right along in that because, again, this is an infrastructure type service provided to PeopleSoft. Therefore, no one should be directly accessing except for troubleshooting activities from DBAs. And if you set up a jump server, a bastion server that would then allow you to do that, you dramatically reduce any exposure around the Elasticsearch side.
Well, thank you, Steve. I think that wraps us up for the day. Please be aware that we will not be having a webinar for the month of August. However, we will be back with a webinar series in September. So stay tuned and stay aware of what we send out here. So thank you very much for attending us, to spending time with us today, and have a great rest of the week. Take care.